The city of Guadalajara was shrouded in a blanket of fog, a kind of stifling air that made the sun hide, but offered no relief from the anxiety that hung over the streets. The street corners, with their street vendors and drug dealers, were immersed in an unusual silence. The hoarse, noisy voices fell silent, as if everyone knew that something very big was about to happen. In the city center, Rodrigo Morales, a small local businessman, felt a weight on the back of his neck, as if he were being watched. It wasn't the kind of watching you can ignore. His restaurant, which had seen better days, seemed like a refuge amidst the chaos. But on that particular day, he knew something was about to turn his life upside down. Rodrigo had heard stories from friends, acquaintances, even family members about how the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the CJNG, operated. The power they wielded, the fear they instilled in everyone, but he never imagined he would find himself at the epicenter of one of its most fatal decisions. The afternoon was drawing to a close when they arrived. They weren't your average neighborhood guys. They had the aura of someone there on a mission, two men with cold stares, as if the world were a simple game of chess. They entered the restaurant and, without saying a word, grabbed Rodrigo. Their movements were swift and silent, and Rodrigo, without a chance to react, was dragged into the waiting car. His body trembled, but he didn't know exactly why. Was it the fear of being on his way to an irreversible end, or the premonition that everything would happen much faster than he could foresee? Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Eduardo El Diablo Ramirez, the commander of the CJNG, was receiving a message. He looked at his phone, his expression unchanged. What he didn't know was that when he ordered Rodrigo's kidnapping, he had made a crucial mistake, a flaw that not even the cartel's absolute power could easily fix. Rodrigo Morales was not the man they were looking for. His name was not among the targets El Diablo had identified, but as always, the cartel never questioned its own mistakes. Hunting the wrong man could have a twist as destructive as the best executed plan. As the car drove through the dark streets, Rodrigo began to hear murmurs. They were low voices, whispers, as if everyone around already knew he wasn't the target, but they were waiting for the inevitable. They would find out soon, and when the truth was revealed, there would be no turning back. Rodrigo forced himself not to think. He thought of his young daughter's smile, of the quiet nights spent with his wife. He thought of the decisions that had led him to this point. He knew that nothing in his life could be more important than that simple, still recent realization. He had been kidnapped by the wrong person. The car made a sharp turn, and the sounds of the deserted streets were interrupted by the metallic ring of a cell phone. The man behind the wheel picked up the device, looked at it, and with an almost imperceptible smile, handed the phone to Rodrigo. It was El Diablo, the voice of the CJNG leader. "Rodrigo Morales," the deep, calculating voice came from the other end. "You have no idea how you got here, but you soon will. You're not where you thought you were. The question is, who will you be when this is over?" Rodrigo took a deep breath, more out of instinct than courage. The pressure in his chest intensified, but he knew this moment would be decisive. One choice, his choice, could turn everything upside down. And if he was smart enough, perhaps he would be the key to something much bigger. Guadalajara, with its ancient streets and vibrant neighborhoods, was a divided place. Between the heat of the sun and the shade of the narrow streets, social strata overlapped, creating a scenario where power and fear intertwined visibly and uncompromisingly. The government, in its complicit silence, did little to intervene, allowing the violence of groups like the CJNG to dominate the city's most remote areas. Rodrigo had known from a young age that living in Guadalajara required more than courage. It demanded resilience. He was born into a simple family, and his life had followed a path that could even be considered predictable for someone in his social position. He worked hard, struggling to maintain the small restaurant he had inherited from his father, an establishment in the city center that served typical dishes, always with a touch of authenticity. But the cartel wasn't something easy to ignore, especially when it came to the need to pay the fees imposed by its invisible tentacles. Rodrigo had never been a man involved in crime, but he knew enough about it. He knew that anyone who dared to stand up against the cartel could pay the highest price. It was a dangerous game, but he had convinced himself that he could continue his life without getting involved. He never expected the winds of violence to hit him with such force. The night he was kidnapped, Rodrigo thought about how fate had brought him there. He wasn't special, maybe just an ordinary man, but perhaps that was the cartel's mistake, the inability to see beyond the layers of their own interests. He was the wrong man in the wrong place. And now, there in the clutches of the CJNG, his choices would have to be quicker than the time it takes to breathe. On the other side of town, El Diablo observed the scene with cold calm. Eduardo El Diablo Ramirez was no ordinary man. Born in a small rural town in Mexico, he had grown up surrounded by violence and the constant need to protect himself. His first contact with the criminal world was an accident, an instinctive reaction to the death of his older brother, a victim of a clash between rival factions. But what began as simple revenge soon turned into something much bigger. Over time, El Diablo rose within the cartel, becoming not only a commander, but also the personification of impunity. He had a clear vision of the world. Power was the only currency that mattered, and everything else should be subjugated to it. But, unlike the other leaders who preferred direct and visible violence, El Diablo was patient. He knew that to stay on top, it was necessary to act in the shadows, manipulating every move with surgical precision. If Rodrigo were truly who the cartel believed him to be, El Diablo would have killed him without a second thought. But there was something about him, something inexplicable, that began to intrigue the leader. It wasn't the fact that Rodrigo was an ordinary businessman, or that he resembled someone El Diablo already knew. It was deeper than that. It was a vague feeling, a premonition that within that man there might be a key that could turn the tide in his favor, or conversely lead to his downfall. The mistake made with Rodrigo wasn't just an operational failure, it was a reflection of El Diablo's blind faith in his own men and his ability to control everything. But like any leader who relies on fear to maintain power, El Diablo knew that unpredictability could be his greatest enemy. As the hours passed, the heavy silence in the city reflected the growing tension within the cartel's walls. The mistake was about to be discovered, but what would come next, no one could predict. Rodrigo and El Diablo's paths were, ironically, more intertwined than ever. The tension in the air was palpable. The silence that had followed the CJNG's mistake had turned into a constant noise, as if every street in the city were intently watching their next moves. Rodrigo felt his muscles tense, fear dominating his thoughts. The car he was in, now in constant motion, felt like a prisoner's den. He didn't know where he was being taken, nor what would happen when they finally reached their destination. However, one thing was certain: he was no longer the innocent man he had been a few hours earlier. Rodrigo's hands were tied, but his mind was sharper than ever. He considered his options, his possible exits, while the only sound filling the car's interior was his heart beating faster. On the other side of town, El Diablo was preparing his next move. The discovery of the mistake had reached him more quickly than he had imagined. When the cartel made the error, it seemed like just an operational glitch, a small mistake that could be quickly corrected. But he knew that, in the world they lived in, mistakes like that could destroy everything he had built. And El Diablo wasn't willing to lose control so easily. In a dark room, illuminated only by the cold light of a lantern, he spoke with his most trusted men. Among them was Sergio, one of El Diablo's henchmen, known for his unwavering loyalty, but also for the brutality with which he dealt with anyone considered an obstacle. "Let's settle this quickly. He's not worth it, but we need to show who's in charge here," said El Diablo, his voice low but full of an authority that made even the hardest of men tremble. If the guy isn't who we're looking for, then do whatever it takes to finish him off. Rodrigo was about to learn, in a painful way, that the cartel didn't deal with mistakes the same way ordinary people did. Meanwhile, he was preparing for what would likely be the longest night of his life. In the car, the henchman responsible for the transport glanced quickly at Rodrigo. He seemed nervous, which was a clear sign to the kidnapped man. Something was wrong. If it were a simple mistake, they would have made a quicker decision. The apprehension in the air indicated that the CJNG knew they had made a mistake, but they had no idea how to correct it. At that moment, Rodrigo realized something he hadn't understood before. The cartel wasn't just a monster of power and violence. It was also a disorganized entity, full of insecurities, like any other organization built on fear and blind trust. And that mistake, that small slip, was the crack that could make everything crumble. As the vehicle approached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Rodrigo couldn't help but think about his own choices. He had always thought his life was normal, peaceful. But now, he found himself at the epicenter of a war he hadn't chosen. The cartel, with its overwhelming power, had never imagined that a simple mistake could trigger such an unpredictable series of events. The car stopped abruptly. The door opened, and two heavily armed men pulled Rodrigo out. He had no choice but to follow, his eyes fixed on the ground, feeling the weight of the situation fall upon him. But deep down, he knew that the power was no longer in El Diablo's hands, nor in the strong arms of his henchmen. The power lay in the fact that Rodrigo now had a chance. He knew that the mistake made by the CJNG would not go unpunished. Meanwhile, news that the cartel had kidnapped the wrong man spread like wildfire. The city, always vibrant and full of life, now breathed with a heavy tension. Some began to murmur about the mistake the cartel had made. Others began to wonder how far this mistake could lead. Fear, once again, was becoming a constant in everyone's lives, and the CJNG, with all its strength, still didn't know what it was about to face. The truth, however, was simple. The mistake had been made, and there was no going back. Rodrigo held something in his hands, something invisible until then, but powerful enough to change the course of history and perhaps his own life. The warehouse where Rodrigo was taken was permeated with the metallic smell of violence lurking in the shadows. The dim light illuminating the place seemed desolate, as if the walls were silent witnesses to countless torments. The sound of footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as he was pushed inside. The tension in the air was thick, heavier than the silence itself. Meanwhile, the city of Guadalajara seemed to have stopped in time. The streets continued to be filled with the same faces and the same whispering voices, but now there was something more, an expectation. The mistake made by the cartel was no longer a secret. People felt that something was about to happen, something that could change the course of their lives. Inside the warehouse, Rodrigo realized he wasn't alone. Besides the two thugs who had led him there, a third man stood out from the others. He was older, with a look that seemed to hide something much deeper. When the man approached, Rodrigo felt a chill, but couldn't understand why. The man, with a serious expression, approached Rodrigo and observed him attentively. "So you're the mistake in question." His voice was low, almost muffled, but it had a force that immediately silenced the other henchmen. "Who sent you here, and why?" Rodrigo, his eyes fixed on the ground, took a deep breath. He knew he no longer had easy answers. His brain, previously clouded with fear, was now beginning to work, searching for a way out. He wasn't a criminal, but he also knew he needed to think like one. "I don't know what's happening." Rodrigo's voice was firm, but his heart was racing. "I'm just an ordinary guy. I was kidnapped because someone with my name was mistaken for someone else. I'm not who you think I am." The older man smiled subtly, as if he were enjoying a game that hadn't yet been revealed. "Ah, of course. What you are is irrelevant. What matters is what's going to happen now. He stepped back and gestured for the henchman to follow him. Rodrigo knew that to survive, he would have to act fast. The shadow of death hung over him, but there was also something else, an opportunity. He realized that the older man was at a higher level within the organization, and what intrigued him most was the fact that he didn't seem concerned about what Rodrigo knew or didn't know. This could only mean one thing. El Diablo, or whoever it was, had already decided his fate. But he also knew that it wouldn't be easy for the cartel to deal with the mistake. Something inside Rodrigo was beginning to unravel, and he felt that he was no longer at everyone's mercy as before. Outside the warehouse, the cityscape of Guadalajara was rapidly changing. People began gathering on street corners, exchanging rumors and speculations. Among them was Teresa, a young woman who worked as a waitress at Rodrigo's restaurant. She had heard the news about the kidnapping and knew his name was circulating as part of the CJNG's mistake. Although she had never imagined that Rodrigo's fate would intersect with that of the cartel's henchman, Teresa couldn't stop thinking about him. She knew that Rodrigo, with all his honesty and simplicity, would never be able to withstand the cartel's cruelty. And more importantly, she knew that he had something inside him that, if awakened, could be the key to something much greater than simply rescuing an ordinary man. Determined to understand what was happening and to save Rodrigo, Teresa decided to infiltrate the cartel's world, or at least find out more about the mistake made and who had really been the target of the kidnapping. Her objective was clear. She needed to act fast because she knew that in El Diablo's world, time was something that could not be wasted. Meanwhile, El Diablo, immersed in his own thoughts and strategies, felt the weight of the failure growing. The pressure mounted, but he couldn't afford to show any weakness. The mistake was far from a simple operational glitch. It was something bigger, something that could affect the entire structure of his power. The clock was ticking. With each passing minute, the complexities of the situation increased. Rodrigo's fate was intertwined in ways he didn't yet fully understand. But he knew one thing: no one in Mexico escaped the clutches of the CJNG without paying a high price. Night fell over Guadalajara, and with it the city was shrouded in shadows. The warehouse where Rodrigo was imprisoned now seemed more like a silent battlefield. He felt the pressure mounting with each passing second. With each step, he drew closer to the decision that would define his life. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, his fate was already sealed. Rodrigo observed the men around him, their calculated movements, and their eyes devoid of any emotion. The figure of the older man, who seemed to be the true mastermind behind the operation, continued to command the room with a cold gaze, while the henchman awaited orders. However, something changed. The phone rang, breaking the tense silence. The older man calmly picked up the device, but his expression changed when he heard the voice on the other end. Rodrigo knew that whatever the message was, it would be important. He tried to understand what was happening, but the words wouldn't come clearly. The only thing he could do was wait and watch. Suddenly, the older man, now visibly disconcerted, dropped the phone on the table. He looked directly at Rodrigo, and his gaze, until then impassive, transformed into a mixture of frustration and confusion. Something was wrong. You're not who I thought you were, he said, his voice lower than usual, but heavy with something Rodrigo couldn't identify. Rodrigo frowned, confused. He still didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that, somehow, this was the crucial moment. The older man, with a swift gesture, ordered the henchman to take him to a different room. When Rodrigo entered, the light was brighter, and he noticed something peculiar. The place seemed to have been prepared for a deeper conversation, something beyond a simple kidnapping. "It's not you," the man said again. "You're not the guy we're looking for. But what you know, now that's interesting." Rodrigo was tense. He didn't know what the man meant by those words. The truth was, he still had no idea exactly who the cartel's target was. However, with each passing moment, the atmosphere of mystery intensified. What seemed to be a simple flaw in the capture process now took on a much larger dimension. Before he could answer, the older man's phone rang again, interrupting the moment. He answered quickly, and the conversation was short but revealing enough. The tension in the room increased. Something had happened. Something Rodrigo didn't yet fully understand, but which would certainly change everything. As he hung up, the older man stared at Rodrigo with increasing intensity. "It seems the mistake wasn't yours, but rather that of whoever is behind this. They gave us the wrong person. But you, Rodrigo Morales, are now part of something much bigger than you realize." Rodrigo felt a chill run down his spine. He was about to discover that the CJNG's mistake wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, it was a strategic failure. El Diablo and his gang's real target was someone in a much higher position than he could ever have imagined. The silence that followed was thick. Rodrigo looked at the older man, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. The cartel, with its network of power and influence, now found itself facing a situation they hadn't even anticipated. The key to this turnaround was in Rodrigo's hands, although he didn't yet know how to use it. Suddenly, the phone rang again. But this time, the person on the other end of the line was someone Rodrigo didn't recognize, but who certainly knew the cartel very well. He was an important player, someone whose identity even El Diablo himself didn't expect to find. "Rodrigo Morales, you've just become a pawn in a game that will shake the foundations of this cartel. Make no mistake, you have a mission," said the cold voice on the other end of the line. Rodrigo felt the weight of the words. He was no longer the ordinary man trying to survive. Now, he was part of a much bigger game. The mistake CJNG made wasn't just a slip-up. It was a move on a chessboard, and he, unwittingly, was at the center of the play. The older man looked at Rodrigo, his eyes now impenetrable. He knew the game had changed, and he, along with El Diablo, was about to discover that sometimes the biggest mistakes can be the greatest allies. When the cold voice of the mysterious caller uttered those words, something broke inside Rodrigo. He was no longer a simple man trapped in the spiral of a mistake committed by a cartel. Now he was at the epicenter of a much larger plot, where his actions would have repercussions beyond what he could imagine. The older man, who until then had seemed controlling and calculating, was now visibly on high alert. He was no longer dealing with a simple hostage. No, Rodrigo Morales was now a central piece in a power game, where the mistakes made by the CJNG were beginning to accumulate. The cartel was starting to realize that the situation was out of its control. Rodrigo felt a mixture of adrenaline and dread. He knew that somehow he was about to play El Diablo's game. He didn't know if it was a stroke of luck or an unforgiving fate, but something told him that the only way to survive was to understand the implications of his choices. The cartel, once monolithic and infallible, was now cracking under the pressure of its failures. The mistake was no longer just about a mistaken identity. Now it was about who had actually been the target of the kidnapping. Inside the warehouse, the tension was palpable. Every move seemed like a decision that could change everything. The henchmen, who had previously seemed invincible in their brutality, were now visibly uncomfortable. They knew something was about to explode, but they didn't understand the extent of what was to come. Outside, the streets of Guadalajara continued their course, but a new nervousness had settled in. People murmured about the CJNG's failure, and the city felt the weight of uncertainty. Rumors about Rodrigo's kidnapping and possible identity swapping began to spread like wildfire. This sparked the interest of several important figures, and not just on the cartel side. Teresa, already determined to save Rodrigo, knew he wasn't just any hostage. She had a feeling that Rodrigo's simple, reserved life hid something much bigger. She began searching for answers, seeking contacts and information, determined to discover who was really behind the mess. She knew that if the CJNG's failure were exposed, everyone would be in danger, Rodrigo, herself, and even the innocent bystanders. But there was another figure, whom Rodrigo didn't yet know, who was beginning to move in the shadows. He was an unexpected ally, someone who had his own reasons for wanting to destabilize El Diablo's power. He was an offshoot of the CJNG, an unpredictable player who saw in the cartel's failure an opportunity to shift the balance in his favor. His name was Esteban, a former cartel member who now worked independently. And like many who had left the cartel, he knew that El Diablo's power system was about to disintegrate. Meanwhile, El Diablo, oblivious to all these movements, felt the weight of the spreading failure. The news that the cartel had kidnapped the wrong person was not easy to swallow. For him, the mistake not only affected his authority, but also his image. The cartel could not appear vulnerable. Weakness, once perceived, was like a black hole that would swallow everything in its path. In a secluded office, El Diablo stared at himself in the mirror, as if searching for some answer in his own reflection. His thoughts were confused and paranoia was beginning to creep in. What did Rodrigo know? What else could be revealed about the cartel's failure? And most importantly, who was manipulating the situation behind the scenes? The answer was rapidly approaching, and there was no more time for indecision. The impact of the identity swap was beginning to reverberate within the power structures, and the reaction would be ruthless. El Diablo knew that to regain control, he would need a bold move, something that would mark his superiority over everyone else. Rodrigo, now more aware of the weight of his actions, knew he could no longer turn back. He was at a point of no return, where survival depended not only on escaping captivity, but also on making decisions that would influence the future of everyone around him. He had a choice to make, and the consequences of that choice would reverberate far beyond what he could imagine. The cold light of the warehouse illuminated Rodrigo's features harshly, revealing every trace of tension on his face. He was no longer merely imprisoned or at the mercy of the CJNG thugs. He was now understanding the true game he had been thrown into. Every move, every word exchanged with those men, every new piece of information he heard, gave him another piece of the puzzle. He felt different now. He was no longer subservient to fear, to the idea that everything was beyond his control. The weight of the circumstances was beginning to forge a new kind of strength within him. If there was a chance of getting out of that situation alive, he would need more than just luck. He would need his sharp mind and a dose of courage. Rodrigo was led to a new room, a more modern and less makeshift space than the previous warehouse. The older man, who had been a cold and impassive figure until that moment, was now more restless. The phone rang again, but this time the voice on the other end of the line was not threatening. It was objective and direct. Rodrigo listened attentively to the conversation, perceiving the subtext. There was a shift underway, something he could take advantage of. The fact that he was seen as unimportant to the CJNG could be his chance to turn the tables. He wasn't the target, but he was becoming a crucial factor in the larger plot. The cartel was more focused on protecting its structure than on simple revenge against him. During a brief pause in the conversation, Rodrigo did something he never imagined he would do. He took the initiative. With a swift movement, he used his bound hands to manipulate a hidden knife he had found in one of the henchmen's pockets. He didn't know exactly what he would do with it, but he felt that if he had a chance, it would come quickly. While the older man was distracted by the phone call, Rodrigo used the knife to cut the ropes that bound him. He felt no fear, no nervousness. He felt something new, a determination he didn't know he possessed. He was far from being a hero, but he was beginning to realize he could no longer be a spectator in his own life. Adrenaline surged through him, and when the older man hung up the phone and turned around, Rodrigo was ready. Without hesitation, he grabbed the knife and with a swift movement delivered the first precise blow. The henchman standing beside the older man was caught off guard. Before he could react, Rodrigo was already in motion, quickly making his way to an improvised exit. The thugs reacted immediately, but Rodrigo had already gained control of the situation. He knew he didn't have much time before being surrounded. The previously oppressive and gloomy environment had now become an improvised battlefield, and he was determined to get out of there alive. As he ran through the dark corridors, Rodrigo's mind raced with strategies. Each step he took was not just an act of survival, but an affirmation of his transformation. He was no longer terrified. Instead, he was focused, tactical. He knew he couldn't trust anyone in that space, but what he had now was an unexpected advantage: the power of action. Outside, the city of Guadalajara continued its usual life, but Rodrigo now saw everything differently. The weight of the cartel, which had previously seemed omnipresent and overwhelming, was beginning to fade as he understood how to operate within this system. It wasn't a system he could destroy, but something he could manipulate. Rodrigo wasn't just running away, he was breaking the rules of the game. He knew that CJNG's mistake wasn't just an operational failure, but a strategic flaw he could exploit. As he ran, he began to realize that the world around him was no longer as threatening as before. He grew stronger with each move. That ordinary man who had been kidnapped hours earlier now possessed something far more valuable: control over his own destiny. He didn't know what would happen next, nor what the price of his escape would be, but for the first time, Rodrigo was in control. He would no longer be a hostage. He was now the master of the game, and the game was about to change. The city of Guadalajara had never seemed so charged with tension. The streets, normally vibrant with the movement of daily life, were now permeated with a heavy, expectant atmosphere. The mistake made by the CJNG had triggered a chain reaction, and everyone in some way was preparing for something big. Rodrigo, now more aware of his role, knew he was approaching the decisive moment. There was no more room for hesitation. He had escaped captivity, but his fight was far from over. Now, he had a clear objective: to confront the true enemy, to discover the true identity of the target that the CJNG had mistaken for him, and above all, to destabilize the organization that had so threatened his life. Rodrigo had begun to realize that his transformation wasn't just about physical escape, but about his ability to manipulate the pieces of the game. What he needed now was a strategy. He wasn't alone. Teresa, who had always been more than just a waitress, had infiltrated enemy lines, seeking crucial information about the cartel's next moves. She knew time was against them, but the pressure made her even more determined. With each passing day, the net closed in. The CJNG was already beginning to react to Rodrigo's moves. His mistake had become something much bigger than a simple identity error. The possibility of an internal betrayal, a threat to El Diablo's power, was becoming a reality. The most influential figures within the cartel were beginning to realize that the game had changed. Rodrigo now needed to do something bold. The information he and Teresa had gathered over the past few days indicated that CJNG's next big move would be to eliminate any threat to its structure. They would erase any trace of the mistake they had made, and Rodrigo, unknowingly, was at the center of this operation. But he wouldn't be a pawn in his own story. Now he had a plan. He knew he needed to reach a key figure within the CJNG, someone who could become an unlikely ally. Esteban, the former cartel member, was a crucial piece on this chessboard. He had essential information about the cartel's internal structure and El Diablo's weaknesses. But Esteban was also a dangerous figure. His loyalty was at stake, and Rodrigo knew he needed to convince him that his intentions were more than just simple revenge. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around Rodrigo was beginning to heat up. The city of Guadalajara, always vibrant, now seemed to be preparing for an imminent confrontation. The streets were emptier, the merchants more tense, and the whispers of people on street corners indicated that everyone was aware that something big was about to happen. The CJNG, despite its strength, could no longer hide the fragility that was now spreading through its ranks. Rodrigo was at a critical point. He was no longer the man who had been kidnapped. He had become a threat, a shadow that stretched ever further into the cartel's empire. What he was about to do now could be his last move. Either he would rise to take control, or he would fall under the weight of the cartel's reaction. With the plan beginning to take shape, Rodrigo knew the confrontation was near. Esteban would become either his ally or his enemy, but one thing was certain: no one would emerge unscathed from this game. All the pieces were in motion, and the final battle wasn't just about to happen, it had already begun. The approaching night brought with it a sense of anticipation. The city was quiet, but its inhabitants somehow felt that the worst was yet to come. The key figures in the cartel were positioning themselves, and El Diablo already knew that the pressure on him was immense. His authority was threatened in an unprecedented way, and Rodrigo Morales, with all his transformation, would be the catalyst for the end of this cycle of violence. Rodrigo took a deep breath, feeling the cool night breeze. He was ready. There was no turning back. The climax was in sight. The city of Guadalajara was silent, but the air held a palpable tension. Rodrigo was about to confront what, until then, seemed unattainable: the true face of the CJNG. He knew the confrontation would be violent, but he could no longer hesitate. There was too much at stake now. The battle was no longer about his survival, but about control of everything the cartel had tried to dominate. He was in a dark alley, far from the busy streets. Esteban, the former cartel member, was beside him, holding a pistol with a calmness that contrasted sharply with Rodrigo's nervousness. The operation was risky. They were going to attack the heart of El Diablo's empire directly, the warehouse complex where the largest shipments of drugs and weapons were sent to the global market. Rodrigo, his back against the wall, was breathing heavily. The plan was in place. The cartel would never have imagined that someone from their own circle would betray them so openly. Esteban had detailed information about the complex, and Rodrigo would use everything he could to finally bring down El Diablo's network. "Remember, it's now or never," Esteban said, his voice deep and his expression unflappable. "Once we go in, there's no turning back. Either you destroy El Diablo, or he will destroy us all." Rodrigo nodded. He was no longer the insecure man who had fallen into the clutches of the cartel. Every step he took now was calculated, cold, and with a single objective in mind: to bring down the criminal empire that had imprisoned him. They moved toward the warehouse, their shadows blending into the darkness of the night. Inside, the CJNG henchmen were scattered, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Rodrigo and Esteban had only one advantage: surprise. When they reached the entrance to the warehouse, Rodrigo felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He could no longer hide in the shadows. He could no longer be the man who ran from danger. Now, he was the hunter. With a signal from Esteban, he entered, his pistol in hand. The sound of footsteps echoed through the vast, empty space. The henchmen, mostly distracted, didn't notice their arrival until it was too late. Rodrigo and Esteban attacked in perfect synchronicity, eliminating the guards one by one. But they weren't there just for some kind of raid. They knew El Diablo would be present, and the final confrontation was about to happen. Rodrigo felt a mixture of anger and determination. He knew he was getting closer to the truth. The cartel's mistake wasn't just a case of mistaken identity, but a fatal blow to its own structure. They had switched targets, but their true power was about to be revealed. Suddenly, a door opened ahead, and Rodrigo saw at the end of the corridor the figure of El Diablo with his icy and menacing gaze. He was waiting. And he knew that the final battle would be between the two, the man who had been captured by mistake and the leader of one of the most powerful cartels in the world. El Diablo didn't seem surprised. He already knew this confrontation was coming, that it would all be the culmination of his own downfall. The cartel, with all its brutality and power, was slowly crumbling. But El Diablo wasn't a man who gave up easily. He smiled, as if he had foreseen everything. "Did you come seeking revenge, Rodrigo?" El Diablo's voice cut through the silence, deep and full of contempt. "You don't understand. This was never about you. It was never about a mistake. This is about power. The power I have. The power that no one can take from me." Rodrigo didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. El Diablo's words no longer made sense to him. He was no longer the man who feared his empire. He had transformed into something stronger, something greater. "This isn't about revenge," Rodrigo said, his voice firm. "It's about justice." The shot was quick. El Diablo didn't have time to react. The bullet hit his hand, making him drop the weapon immediately. But he didn't fall. Instead, he looked at Rodrigo with a bitter smile. "Do you think this is the end of it?" he said, laughing bitterly. "You're playing with fire, Rodrigo." But Rodrigo was no longer in doubt. The cartel was crumbling. El Diablo's power was no longer enough to control everything around him. The mistake made by the CJNG, which seemed like an irreversible failure, was now turning into a decisive victory for him. Rodrigo moved forward, determined to end the cycle of violence and power that had destroyed so many lives, including his own. The confrontation with El Diablo was at its peak, and he knew that by defeating him, everything the cartel represented would also fall. The fight was intense. El Diablo fought with desperate ferocity, but Rodrigo was immersed in a flow of action that was no longer about simple survival. It was about rewriting his destiny, and finally, with a decisive move, he managed to dominate the fight. El Diablo was on the ground, defeated, and the reign of terror he commanded began to crumble. Rodrigo looked around, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He had achieved what seemed impossible. The CJNG was no longer in control, and the city, though still scarred, was beginning to feel the relief of a new era. The sun was beginning to set over Guadalajara, tinging the sky with a soft orange hue, as if the city were breathing deeply after the storm. The streets, now tranquil, seemed a reflection of the transformation Rodrigo had undergone. The man who had entered that nightmare, mistaken for someone else, was now standing free from the yoke of El Diablo and the oppressive power of the CJNG. However, Rodrigo's victory did not come without its costs. The cartel had been destroyed, but traces of its violence and influence were still visible. The scars left on Rodrigo's body and soul would not fade so easily. He knew that peace was only temporary, and that the echoes of war still resonated through those streets. Teresa, standing beside him, looked at him with a mixture of relief and concern. They had weathered the worst moments of their lives together, and now, although the battle was won, the future still seemed uncertain. "And now?" she asked, her voice soft but full of meaning. Rodrigo looked at her, feeling the weight of her words, but also the hope that was beginning to blossom. He had changed, but what lay ahead was a new path, one he would need to walk without the shadows that had once haunted him. Now, it's time to rebuild, not just the city, but myself. He took a deep breath, feeling relief but also the responsibility of what was still to come. The cartel's power has been broken, but the city needs time to heal, and I need to discover what it truly means to live. They walked together through the quiet streets, far from the echoes of weapons and violence. The city was far from perfect, but now there was a chance for something new. The cartel no longer controlled people's destinies. Rodrigo was no longer a pawn in their power game. He was now the archetype of a man who had overcome his dark past and looked to the future with the strength of someone who had won his freedom. Gradually, more people began to gather in the streets, smiles of relief etched on their faces. The shadow of the CJNG had been eradicated, and the new generations could now breathe without fear. But the true transformation, Rodrigo thought, wasn't about defeating a crime empire. It was about changing what was inside, about understanding that true freedom came from controlling one's own choices. He didn't know what the future held, but he was ready to face it, without fear, without regrets, and for the first time, with the certainty that the game was finally in his hands. Months later, the city of Guadalajara continued its recovery. Rodrigo, now more at peace, rebuilt his life with Teresa by his side. They opened a small restaurant, a symbol of the new chance life had offered them. The weight of the dark days was behind them, but the memories remained, like marks on his soul. He knew that while the city breathed new air, the world of crime would never completely disappear. But Rodrigo now had the power to choose his path, and somehow he knew he had finally achieved true freedom, the freedom to be who he wanted to be. Rodrigo went from a man trapped by fate to someone who, through his choices and courage, rewrote his life and the lives of everyone around him. With intense action, profound transformations, and a satisfying conclusion, the narrative reaches a natural closure, leaving no loose ends, but maintaining an air of reflection on the future. And you, what would you do if you were in Rodrigo's place? In a fight for survival, how far would you go to regain control of your life? Rodrigo's journey shows us that even in the face of the cruelest adversities, it is possible to rewrite destiny. Share your reflections on the story and tell us, how would you confront an empire of power and violence? Don't forget to share this story with your friends and family. Who knows, they might also be inspired to take the reins of their own lives, just as Rodrigo did. Let's talk about it.